The fall into the deep the rain had been falling since morning, heavy and cold. Dark clouds covered the alien sky, making the day feel like night. Jack stood near the edge of the wide river, his boots sinking into the wet ground. He had come here to deliver food crates to a mining outpost across the valley. The river was louder than usual, swollen with rainwater and rushing faster than he had ever seen. It looked dangerous, wild, and ready to swallow anything that touched it. Jack's mind was on his work when a sound cut through the roar of the water. It was high-pitched, weak, and desperate. He froze and listened again. There it was, another cry, this time louder, almost a scream. It didn't sound human. It sounded smaller, like a frightened child. Jack looked toward the source of the noise and saw something moving in the water. A tiny figure was struggling in the current, arms thrashing, head going under again and again. For a moment, he thought it might be debris, but then he saw a face small, with pale blue skin and faint glowing lines across the cheeks. An alien child, no more than 6 or 7 years old. She was drowning. On the opposite shore, a group of people stood watching. Some were humans, some were aliens. They shouted to each other, pointing at the girl. But no one moved to help. Jack heard one man say, "Not our problem, she's not one of us." Another voice added, "The current's too strong. You'd die before you reached her." Jack's hands clenched. He didn't care if she was human or not. A child was a child. And she was seconds away from being pulled under forever. Without thinking, he pulled off his jacket, dropped his bag, and ran straight for the edge. The cold hit him like a wall as he plunged into the river. The water was icy and heavy, pushing against him with every stroke. The current grabbed him instantly, dragging him downstream. He fought it, kicking hard, his eyes locked on the small blue figure ahead. Every time she surfaced, she coughed and gasped, her tiny hands clawing at the air. Jack's heart pounded. Not from the swim, but from fear that he might be too late. Something brushed against his leg under the water. It was large, smooth, and gone in an instant. He didn't want to think about what it was. He just swam harder. Rain hammered the surface around him, making it harder to see. The girl's head went under again. Jack dived, reaching into the dark water. His fingers closed around her thin arm. She was lighter than he expected. Almost weightless, kicking hard, he pulled her to the surface. Her eyes were closed, her body limp. "Come on, kid, stay with me," he muttered through chattering teeth. The current tried to tear her away, but he wrapped his arm tightly around her. The nearest bank was still far. Jack turned sideways, swimming at an angle to fight the current. Every muscle in his body screamed. He could feel his strength draining. But he refused to let go. The rain blurred everything, turning the world into gray and white streaks. Still, he kept going. Finally, his feet touched the muddy bottom. The river tried to pull him back, but he pushed forward step by step. When he reached the shore, he collapsed onto the wet ground, still holding the girl. She lay motionless, her skin cold, her chest barely moving. Jack knelt beside her, water streaming from his hair and face. He pressed his ear to her chest and heard the faintest breath. People from the other side had crossed over, now standing a short distance away. No one came closer. Some whispered to each other in low voices. Jack ignored them. He tilted the girl's head back, checking her airway like he'd been taught in training. Then he began helping her breathe, forcing air into her small lungs. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she coughed, water spilling from her mouth. Her eyes fluttered open. Glowing faintly in the dim light, she looked at Jack with confusion and fear. Her lips moved, forming strange words in a language he didn't know. Her voice was soft and shaky, almost lost in the sound of the rain. Jack didn't understand. But the way she clung to his shirt, told him enough she was terrified. He wrapped his jacket around her trembling body. She kept glancing toward the forest beyond the river, as if expecting something to come out. Jack followed her gaze, through the trees. Dark shapes were moving. They were tall, wearing armor that reflected the faint light. Long weapons glowed in their hands. Even from here, Jack could feel the danger. In their slow, deliberate steps, the girl's breathing quickened. Her grip on his shirt tightening, she whispered the same strange word again and again. Whatever was coming, she didn't want to be found by them. Jack stood up, holding her close. Rainwater dripped from his clothes. Mixing with the mud under his boots, the hunters were getting closer. He didn't know who they were or why they wanted her, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to hand her over. Not after what he'd just risked to pull her from the river. Somewhere deep inside, Jack felt the shift. This was no longer just a rescue. This was the start of something much bigger. And as the shadows drew nearer, he knew there would be no turning back. Jack moved quickly away from the riverbank. His arms wrapped tightly around the alien girl. Her small frame shivered violently in his grip, her wet skin icy to the touch. The rain still poured down, soaking them both, but Jack didn't care. All that mattered was getting her somewhere safe, somewhere warm. The hunters' shapes were still visible through the trees, their glowing weapons slicing faint light into the storm. He didn't know how much time they had before they spotted him. He reached a cluster of large boulders near the base of a steep hill. There, hidden between the rocks, was a narrow cave. It wasn't much, but it would shield them from the rain for a while. Jack ducked inside, the girl still in his arms, and set her gently on the ground. She was breathing, but her breaths were short and shallow. Her lips had a faint purple hue, and her eyes blinked slowly, like she was fighting to stay awake. Jack knelt beside her, brushing wet hair from her face. It wasn't hair like a human's, it was softer, more like thin strands of glowing silk. They clung to her cheeks, trembling in the cold. "It's okay, kid. You're safe now," Jack said softly, even though he knew she probably didn't understand. She gave no response, except for a weak sound. Barely louder than the rain outside, Jack quickly searched his pack. He pulled out a thermal blanket and wrapped it tightly around her small body. Then he took off his own wet shirt, using it to wipe some of the water from her skin. Her hands twitched slightly at his touch, as though unsure whether to pull away or hold on when he tried to give her water from his canteen. She hesitated, staring at it like she didn't know what it was. Jack mimed drinking, and after a moment, she copied him. Sipping carefully, her large, glowing eyes focused on him for the first time since the rescue. They were unlike anything he'd seen, deep, shimmering colors that seemed to shift like the surface of a lake. She said something in her language, slow and uncertain. Jack shook his head gently. "I don't understand," he replied. She repeated the same words she had been whispering before and pointed toward the forest. Her expression told him enough. Whoever was out there, she was terrified of them. A sudden noise outside made Jack tense. It was faint at first, a low hum, mechanical, growing closer. He crawled to the edge of the cave and peeked out through the curtain of rain. He saw one of the hunters moving along the riverbank, scanning the ground. Another figure appeared beside him, both of them speaking into devices on their wrists. Jack's pulse quickened. They were tracking her, and it wouldn't be long before they found his trail. He returned to the girl and spoke in a calm voice, even though his own nerves were on edge. "We have to move soon," he said. She tilted her head, clearly not understanding the words, but sensing his urgency, Jack helped her to her feet, keeping the blanket wrapped around her. She was light, too light. Like she hadn't eaten properly in days. Her steps were unsteady, and she leaned against him for support as they slipped out the back of the cave and began moving uphill. Jack kept scanning for a better hiding spot. The rain was a blessing, masked their tracks and kept their scent down, but it also made every surface slippery, forcing them to move slowly. Twice the girl stumbled, and both times Jack caught her before she fell. She looked up at him with a mix of surprise and something softer, like she wasn't used to someone catching her when she fell. They reached a cluster of old alien ruined stone walls covered in vines. Glowing faintly from the plants that had grown over them, Jack led her inside, crouching behind a half-collapsed wall. Here, they could rest for a moment. The girl sat close to him, still wrapped in the blanket. Jack reached into his pack again and pulled out a ration bar, breaking it into small pieces. At first she hesitated, but hunger won. She took the food in both hands and ate quickly, glancing around as if afraid someone might take it from her. Watching her, Jack felt a twist in his chest. She was just a child, yet everything about her spoke of fear and survival, whatever life she had before. It hadn't been safe, and now, it seemed, the danger had followed her here. When she finished eating, she leaned slightly against his arm, her eyes half closed. Jack let her rest for a moment. Though his own mind was racing, he needed answers: who she was, why she was being hunted, and what would happen if they caught her. But for now, the only thing that mattered was staying ahead of their pursuers. Outside, the low hum returned. Louder this time, Jack peered over the wall and saw a faint beam of light sweeping through the trees. The hunters were close to close. He turned back to the girl. Her glowing eyes were open again, watching him with quiet trust. Jack didn't know why she trusted him, but he wasn't about to break that trust. "All right, kid," he murmured, tightening the blanket around her. "Let's get you out of here." And with that, he lifted her into his arms once more and slipped into the shadows of the ruins. The rain swallowed their footsteps, but behind them, the hunters kept coming. The forest was quiet, except for the sound of rain dripping from the high branches. Jack moved slowly, every step careful, his eyes scanning the shadows. The little alien girl clung to him, her small hands gripping the fabric of his shirt. She didn't speak, but her glowing eyes kept darting to the trees. She was listening, sensing something he could not, and every time she stiffened. Jack knew danger was close. The ruins behind them faded into the darkness. Ahead, the ground sloped upward, the roots of massive alien trees twisting like giant claws. Jack chose the narrowest paths, the ones overgrown with wet ferns and thick vines. He knew these routes well from his supply runs. They were hard to follow and even harder to track. But the hunters were not ordinary pursuers. They had technology, skill, and, most importantly, patience. Through the thick rain, Jack spotted movement to his left. Two tall figures in dark armor were moving silently between the trees. Their armor was not smooth like human battlesuits. It was jagged, layered, and marked with strange glowing symbols. Their weapons were long and curved, with blades that shimmered faintly as if made from liquid light. Even without understanding their language, Jack knew these were not soldiers sent to protect. They were predators sent to capture. Or worse, Jack crouched behind a large root, holding the girl close. Her breathing was fast, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. She whispered that same word again, the one she had said by the river and in the cave. Jack wished he knew what it meant. He guessed it was either the name of the hunters or a warning, but either way, it carried fear in every syllable. The hunters moved in patterns. One would advance while the others scanned the surroundings. Jack realized they were sweeping the forest in a slow, methodical search. They weren't in a hurry. They knew she couldn't get far, and that meant they would keep coming until they had her. Jack's jaw tightened. They had no idea that this time she wasn't alone. He moved again, keeping low. Weaving between the thick roots and fallen logs, the rain masked his movement, but the soft mud threatened to betray him with every step. Once, his foot sank too deep, and he had to pull hard to free it without making a loud noise. The girl stayed silent, her small frame warm against his chest despite her soaked blanket. Jack could feel her heartbeat, fast, steady, but alive. He found himself holding her closer, as if that could shield her from the whole world. A sound cut through the rain, sharp, metallic click. Jack froze instantly. It came from directly ahead. Hidden behind a curtain of vines, he slowly leaned forward, parting the leaves just enough to see. Another hunter stood there, facing away from him, scanning the forest with a small glowing device in hand. Jack knew that if he stepped into that clearing, they'd be spotted in seconds. He retreated a step, thinking quickly. The only other path was steeper, climbing up a ridge covered in moss and loose stone. It would be harder to climb while carrying her, but it would also make them harder too. Follow, Jack shifted her weight and began to climb. The rain made the stones slick, forcing him to dig his boots into cracks for balance. The girl clung tighter. Burying her face against his shoulder, her tiny breaths warmed his neck, a strange comfort in the freezing storm. Halfway up, a sudden flash of light lit the forest. Below, a hunter's weapon discharged, striking the ridge near his feet. Chunks of rock flew past them, and the sharp smell of scorched stone filled the air. Jack didn't wait. He pushed himself harder, grabbing the next handhold, pulling both of them upward. The sound of heavy boots echoed below. They had been spotted by the time he reached the top of the ridge. His arms burned and his chest heaved. But there was no time to rest. He ran along the narrow path, weaving between boulders. Behind them, the hunters' voices called out in deep, rumbling tones. The girl turned her head slightly, her ears twitching at the sound. Her grip on him tightened again, and she whispered something urgent. Jack didn't need a translator to understand. She was telling him to keep going. The ridge ended in a drop, not too high, but steep enough to make him hesitate. He looked down and saw a cluster of old structures, partly buried under soil and vines. They looked like abandoned storage sheds from an earlier colony. Perfect for hiding. Without a second thought, he jumped. Landing in the wet grass below, the girl let out a small gasp, but didn't cry out. Jack quickly darted into the largest structure, shutting the half-broken door behind them. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp metal. Jack set her down gently, kneeling so they were eye level. Her glowing eyes searched his face. "You're safe for now," he whispered. She tilted her head, not understanding the words, but reading the calm in his tone. Somewhere outside, boots splashed through the wet ground. The hunters were still searching. Closer than ever, Jack's hand went to the small knife at his belt. If they found this place, he knew he would have to fight. He looked at her again, small, shivering, yet watching him with a strange trust. Whatever happened next, he couldn't let them take her, not while he was still breathing. The air inside the abandoned structure was cold and heavy. Every sound seemed louder. The slow drip of rainwater through a hole in the roof, the faint rattle of the broken door in the wind, and the distant splashes of boots outside. Jack pressed his back against the wall, his hands still resting on the handle of his knife. The little alien girl sat on a rusted crate, her blanket pulled tightly around her small frame. Her glowing eyes followed him. Wide and unblinking, she seemed to know that the danger outside was only getting closer. Jack moved quietly to the side of the building and peeked through a crack. In the wall, two hunters were approaching from the left, their armor wet and gleaming in the dim light. They moved with slow confidence, scanning the ground and the trees. These weren't reckless pursuers. They were skilled trackers who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Jack's mind raced. The only way to survive would be to move again. But slipping away without being seen would be nearly impossible. The girl whispered something softly. Jack turned to her. She pointed toward the far wall where a section of the metal plating had collapsed. Leaving a jagged hole, it was small, but just big enough for her to crawl through. Beyond it, Jack could see a dark stretch of forest. If they were quiet, they might make it out unseen. He crouched in front of her and placed a finger to his lips. She nodded, understanding the gesture. Jack led her to the hole and helped her through first. The cold rain instantly soaked them again, but it was better than being cornered inside, once outside. Jack took her hand and guided her toward a dense patch of ferns. They moved low, almost crawling, as the hunters passed by just a few meters away. The forest here was thicker, the trees growing close together with wide roots that formed natural tunnels. Jack led the way through one of these dark passages, his boots sinking into the damp soil. The girl kept close behind, her small steps almost soundless. It was strange how she could move so quietly when she wanted to, almost like she had been trained to hide. Every so often she would glance over her shoulder, her ears twitching at sounds Jack couldn't hear. She was guiding him as much as he was guiding her. They reached a ridge that sloped downward toward a narrow stream. Jack knew this place. It curved sharply and disappeared under a thick canopy. If they followed it, they could vanish from sight. But as they began to descend, a sudden crack of a branch made Jack stop. From the shadows above, another hunter appeared, blocking their path. His armor glowed faintly, casting strange light over the wet ground. The curved blade in his hand shimmered as he stepped forward. Jack pushed the girl behind him. The hunter tilted his head as if studying Jack. Then he spoke in a deep, rumbling voice. Jack didn't understand the words, but the tone carried the meaning clearly. It was a warning, a demand to hand her over. Jack shook his head slowly. "No," he said firmly. The hunter's grip on the blade tightened. There was no time to think. Jack lunged forward, closing the distance before the hunter could strike. The knife in Jack's hand flashed as he aimed for the gaps in the alien's armor. The hunter blocked with surprising speed, sparks flying where the two blades met. The force of the impact nearly knocked Jack off his feet, but he held his ground. They traded strikes in the rain, the sound of metal ringing in the damp air. The girl stayed hidden behind a tree, her hands over her mouth to keep from crying out. Jack ducked under a wide swing, using the moment to slam his shoulder into the hunter's chest. The alien stumbled back a step but quickly recovered. Another slash came, this one grazing Jack's arm. The sting was sharp, but it only fueled his determination. He feinted left, then drove his knife forward. The blade found a gap at the side of the hunter's armor, and a sharp cry echoed through the forest. The hunter staggered, but before Jack could finish the fight, another voice shouted from the trees. Two more hunters were approaching fast. Jack grabbed the girl's hand and ran, pulling her toward the stream. They splashed into the cold water, letting the current carry them a short distance before climbing onto the far bank. The rain masked their trail, but the hunters' voices were still close behind. They would have to keep moving. They ran through the forest, weaving between massive roots and hanging vines. Jack's lungs burned. His arm throbbed from the cut, but he didn't stop. The girl kept pace surprisingly well for someone so small, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Finally, they reached a section of the forest where the trees glowed faintly from bioluminescent moss. The light painted their faces in shades of green and blue. Jack pulled her into the shadows of a large, hollow tree. For now, it was the only safe place to catch their breath. She looked up at him, her small face wet from the rain. He could see the question in her eyes. How long could they keep running like this? Jack didn't have an answer. He only knew that as long as he was standing, he wasn't letting them take her. Not now, not ever. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, but the forest still dripped with water. Jack and the little alien girl sat inside the hollow tree, the faint glow of moss casting soft light on their faces. Her small hands clutched the thermal blanket he had wrapped around her. Every so often, she would glance toward the dark woods beyond the opening. Even here, hidden from sight, she didn't relax. Jack could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her ears twitched at every sound. He knew they couldn't stay long. The hunters were skilled, and sooner or later they would find this hiding place. But before they moved, he needed to understand why they were chasing her so relentlessly. Leaning closer, Jack spoke slowly, hoping his tone would be enough to show. He meant no harm. Who are you, kid? Why are they after you? She tilted her head, clearly not understanding the words, but then she seemed to think, as if searching for a way to tell him without language. She looked down at the wet ground between them. With one finger, she began to draw on the mud. Jack leaned in, watching as she traced a series of circles, one large circle surrounded by smaller ones. In the very center, she drew a tiny shape, almost like a star. When she finished, she pointed to herself, then to the star. Jack frowned. Is that you? He asked softly. She nodded, her glowing eyes locking on his. Then she drew another shape, this one jagged and dark. She pointed toward the forest, the direction the hunters had come from. Her expression tightened, her voice low, as she spoke a word he had heard many times now. Jack realized it wasn't just a random sound. It was their name, the hunters. They were after her because of who she was, but that still didn't explain why she mattered so much. She touched the center of her chest, right where her heart would be. Then she lifted the blanket just enough to reveal a small metallic pendant resting against her skin. It was unlike anything Jack had seen, smooth, silver, and glowing faintly with shifting patterns of light. He leaned closer, realizing it wasn't just jewelry. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Almost alive, she took it in her tiny hand and held it out toward him. Jack hesitated, then touched it gently. A strange warmth spread through his fingers, like the pendant recognized his presence. In that moment, Jack understood this wasn't just a child he had saved. She was carrying something valuable, maybe even sacred. The hunters didn't just want her. They wanted whatever was inside that pendant. He pulled his hand back, his mind racing. If the pendant was this important, then she might be connected to powerful people, maybe even royalty. And if that was true, then her capture could start a war. Outside, a faint sound made him tense, a soft hum, the same one he had heard before. The hunters were nearby, moving slowly, searching every shadow. The girl quickly tucked the pendant back under her blanket, her small hands gripping it tightly. Jack reached for his pack. He pulled out a small flare device, not to signal for help, but to use as a distraction. He handed the girl her share of rations and pointed toward a narrow opening at the back of the hollow tree. If they timed it right, they could slip away before the hunters closed in. But before they moved, Jack crouched in front of her again. His voice was low, steady. I'm not leaving you, he said. You understand? I'll get you somewhere safe. She didn't understand the words, but her eyes softened. She reached up and touched his cheek briefly. A small gesture of trust. Jack nodded. Feeling the weight of the promise settle on his shoulders, he activated the flare, tossing it into the opposite direction of their escape route. The bright flash lit up the forest, sending beams of red light through the trees. Shouts erupted as the hunters moved toward the sudden glow. Jack took the girl's hand and led her through the narrow tunnel. The ground was uneven, roots clawing at their feet, but they moved quickly, guided by the faint glow of moss clinging to the walls. When they emerged into the open, they were on the far side of the ridge. From here, the forest opened into a wide field of tall grass swaying in the damp wind. The girl stopped suddenly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Jack followed her eyes and saw a faint blue glow far in the distance. She pointed to it, her voice urgent. He didn't know what it was, but from the way she looked at it, he guessed it was important, maybe even a safe place. The problem was that between them and that glow lay open ground, no trees, no cover. Just wet grass and a long walk that would leave them exposed. Jack scanned the area, weighing the risk behind them. The hunters' voices were growing louder again. They didn't have a choice. He tightened his grip on her hand and started moving, keeping low as they crossed the field. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and something faintly metallic. Jack's boots made almost no sound in the grass, but his eyes stayed locked on. The tree line ahead, every shadow seemed like it could hide danger, but the girl's eyes never left that faint blue glow. Whatever it was, she believed it was their hope. And Jack had already decided if she believed in it, then he would get her there. No matter what it took, the tall grass swayed around them. Hiding their legs but not their shapes, Jack kept moving toward the faint blue glow on the horizon. The girl close beside him. Every step was careful, every movement measured. But the sound behind them was getting louder, metal boots striking wet earth. Voices barking orders in that deep alien language. The hunters had seen them, and this time they were closing in fast. Jack knew they wouldn't make it to the blue light before being caught. The field offered no cover, and running would only give the hunters a clearer shot. He slowed, looking around quickly. His eyes fell on a cluster of jagged stones jutting out from the ground like the bones of some ancient creature. It wasn't much, but it could give them a defensive position. He led the girl toward the rocks, pulling her into the narrow space between two of them. Her wide eyes searched his face. Sensing something was about to happen, Jack crouched, opening his pack and pulling out everything that could be used as a weapon or trap. A length of cable, a flare, a small mining charge, and his survival knife. His training told him one thing. If they were going to get out of this alive, he needed to hold the hunters here, even if it meant taking them all on. He quickly tied the cable between two stones, low enough that a running figure might trip. The mining charge he wedged under a loose slab of rock. Angled toward the path the hunters would take, the flare he kept in his jacket pocket, the knife stayed in his hand. The girl crouched beside him. Clutching her pendant under the blanket, she whispered something quietly. A string of soft sounds that almost sounded like a plea. Jack looked at her and forced a small smile. "You just stay behind me, all right?" he said gently. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Her small hands gripped the back of his jacket as if anchoring herself to him. The first shadow appeared through the grass, tall and armed. Jack's heartbeat slowed, his focus narrowing to the space between them. The hunter moved closer, scanning the rocks when his boot caught the cable. He stumbled forward. Jack was already moving, lunging from behind cover. The knife struck between the armored plates, finding the gap at the neck. The hunter fell with a heavy crash, his weapon clattering to the ground. Shouts erupted as the others charged forward. Jack grabbed the fallen weapon, a long, curved blade, and swung it in a wide arc, forcing the next hunter back. The air was filled with the sound of rain on metal, the hiss of wet grass being cut, and the deep growls of the hunters. Another stepped into range. Swinging his weapon toward Jack's head, Jack ducked low, rolling to the side and kicking the mining charge into place. He slammed his palm against the detonator. A flash of light and a thunderous crack shook the ground, sending shards of rock into the air. The explosion threw two of the hunters off their feet. Jack didn't wait. He was on them before they could recover. The blade in his hand was heavier than his knife, but cut cleanly through their armor at close range. One went down, the other scrambled back, injured but still moving through it all. The girl stayed crouched behind the rocks, her eyes wide but her body frozen. Jack caught glimpses of her clutching her pendant tighter each time the fight raged. Close, the last of the hunters approached slowly. His armor was darker, heavier, marked with deep red symbols. This was their leader, His curved weapon crackled with light, humming with some kind of alien energy. Jack braced himself. The leader spoke a single word, pointing at the girl. Jack's answer was simple. He stepped forward, putting himself between them. The fight was fast and brutal. The leader's strikes came hard and precise, each one forcing Jack back a step. Jack parried with the curved blade, sparks flying in the rain. Once, the leader's weapon grazed his shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through his arm. But Jack didn't stop. He pushed forward, driving the fight away from the girl. A feint to the left gave him the opening he needed. He slashed low, catching the leader's leg. The alien stumbled, giving Jack the moment to knock the weapon from his hands. They locked eyes, both breathing hard. Jack raised the blade, ready to end it, but before he could strike, Lolita looked past him toward the blue glow in the distance. His expression changed, and he stepped back slowly. Jack didn't lower his guard. The leader gave one final glare, then turned and vanished into the grass, calling the others to retreat. Jack stood there for a moment, rain running down his face. His body ached from the fight, his breath coming in sharp bursts. But when he turned back to the girl, she was still there, safe. She ran to him, throwing her small arms around his waist. He knelt, holding her tightly for a brief second. They had survived for now, and the blue light was still waiting. The rain had almost stopped, leaving the tall grass heavy with water. Jack stood for a moment, catching his breath, the curved alien blade still in his hand. The little alien girl held onto his arm, her small fingers gripping tightly. Her eyes were fixed on the faint blue glow ahead, brighter now against the fading storm. It was clear she wanted to reach it. Jack didn't know what waited there, but after everything they had been through, he was willing to follow. They started walking again, moving carefully through the wet grass. The wind carried the smell of dichitomy. The wind carried the smell of rain and earth. Jack kept glancing behind them, watching for any sign of the hunters, but the field was empty. The leader's retreat had bought them some time. Still, Jack knew that time wouldn't last forever. As they moved closer, the glow began to take shape. It wasn't a fire or a settlement. It was something far more strange. A tall, thin pillar of crystal rising from the ground, its surface alive with shifting light. It hummed softly, a deep sound that seemed to vibrate in Jack's chest. The girl's pace quickened, her blanket slipping from her shoulders as she ran ahead. She stopped at the base of the crystal and pressed both hands against it. The light grew brighter instantly. The humming turned into a deep, melodic tone that filled the air. Jack approached slowly, unsure if it was safe. He could see faint symbols moving across the crystal's surface, glowing lines that flowed like water. The girl closed her eyes, whispering something in her language. Then she touched the pendant at her neck, holding it out toward the crystal. The reaction was immediate. The light from the crystal surged upward into the sky. Clouds parted as a beam of pure blue shot high above, cutting through the fading storm. Jack shielded his eyes from the sudden brightness. The girl stepped back, looking up with wide, tear-filled eyes. A deep rumble rolled across the land. And then Jack saw something massive descending through the clouds. A ship, not like any human design. Its hull shimmered like liquid silver. Shifting in color as it moved, it made no sound as it hovered above the crystal. The girl's face lit with joy. She turned to Jack, speaking rapidly, her voice full of urgency and excitement. He couldn't understand the words, but he could understand her meaning. Help was here. A column of light descended from the ship, touching the ground beside the crystal. The girl looked at Jack, then reached for his hand. She pulled him toward the beam, but he stopped. "This is your people," he said softly. "You're safe now." She shook her head, her eyes pleading with him. She didn't want to leave without him. Before Jack could respond, movement in the grass caught his attention. The hunters had returned. the leader emerged. First, his dark armor reflecting the glow of the beam. His weapon was back in his hands, and his voice roared across the field. The girl's grip on Jack's hand tightened in fear. Jack stepped in front of her. Raising the blade he still held, the hunters advanced quickly, but before they could reach the crystal, a new sound filled the air, a sharp, resonating pulse. From the ship above, it hit the ground like a wave, knocking the hunters back. The leader tried to rise, but a beam of light from the ship swept over him. His armor froze mid-motion, locked by some unseen force. One by one, the hunters were lifted from the ground and pulled into the air. Vanishing into the darkness above, the girl ran to Jack and threw her arms around him. The beam of light at the crystal's base grew warmer, more inviting. Jack looked at her, then at the ship waiting above. She pointed to herself, then to him, then to the beam. The message was clear. She wanted him to come with her. Jack hesitated. His life was here, on this planet, but so was danger. If he stayed, the hunters might return. If he left, maybe he could protect her better. She stepped closer, placing her small hand over his heart. Her glowing eyes held his without wavering. In that moment, he knew his choice. Jack took her hand, and together they stepped into the beam. Warmth surrounded him, lifting them gently into the air. The ground fell away beneath them, the field, the crystal, and the hunters all shrinking into the distance. When they entered the ship, the light faded, replaced by a soft golden glow. Figures waited inside, tall, graceful aliens with the same glowing patterns as the girl. They spoke to her in their language, relief clear in their voices. She pointed to Jack and said something firmly. The tallest alien stepped forward, bowing slightly to him. Jack didn't understand the words, but the gesture said enough. He was welcome here. The girl smiled at him, the first true smile he had seen on her face. For the first time since pulling her from the river, Jack felt a weight lift from his chest. The danger was behind them. The future was unknown, but as the ship rose higher into the sky, leaving the storm and the planet below, he knew one thing for certain. He hadn't just saved her life. She had changed his forever.